In April 1945, as Nazi Germany crumbles and Allied forces push deeper into enemy territory, Sergeant James Morrison and his British military police unit stumble upon an abandoned prison camp in the German countryside. Inside, they discover dozens of female prisoners of war, French resistance fighters, Soviet soldiers and Allied operatives who have been left without food or water for over a week as their captors fled. Against direct orders to maintain their patrol route and avoid unauthorized engagements, Morrison makes a fateful decision. "You're coming with me," he tells the weakened women, knowing that moving them could cost him his career or his life. With German stragglers still roaming the area and his own command questioning his whereabouts, Morrison and his small team must navigate through hostile territory to bring these forgotten prisoners to safety. What begins as a simple act of humanity becomes a race against time, as the group faces not only the physical challenges of their journey, but also the moral complexities of war, the bonds formed in desperation, and the question of how far one should go to do what's right when the world is falling apart. The cold, damp air of late April 1945 clung to the skeletal remains of what was once a vibrant German forest, now a graveyard of charred timber and muddy craters. A thick, grey mist perpetually hung low, blurring the lines between shattered earth and the perpetually overcast sky. Sergeant James Morrison, a British military police officer, moved with a practiced, weary gait, his boots squelching in the mud, rifle held at the ready. His uniform, once crisp, was now a tapestry of dried mud and wrinkles, mirroring the exhaustion etched onto his face. Behind him, 3 other men from his unit. Corporal David Hughes, a wiry, perpetually anxious man who always seemed to be counting bullets. Private Thomas "Tommy" Miller, young and eager, his eyes wide with the raw reality of war, and Private John "Mac" Macmillan, a burly, quiet Scot who moved like a shadow, followed in grim silence. They were deep in enemy territory, far from the main thrust of the Allied advance, their patrol route an isolated finger extending into the collapsing Reich. Orders were clear: maintain surveillance, report any significant enemy movement, and avoid direct engagement unless absolutely necessary. The war, everyone knew, was almost over, but its dying throes were proving to be the most vicious. The smell hit them first, a foul, clinging stench of decay and unwashed humanity that cut through the metallic scent of damp earth and distant cordite. Morrison held up a hand, his senses on high alert. He gestured for Hughes to fan out to the right, Mac to the left, Tommy covering their rear. They advanced cautiously, each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig, sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. A makeshift barbed wire fence, crudely erected, appeared through the trees, glinting dully in the weak light. This wasn't on any map. A shiver ran down Morrison's spine. They had found it, an abandoned prison camp. The camp was a squalid collection of hastily constructed wooden barracks, some partially burned, surrounded by remnants of watchtowers. The gate hung open, swaying on a single hinge. Inside, the silence was almost more terrifying than the smell. Morrison pushed open the door of the first barrack. The sight that greeted him stole the breath from his lungs. Dozens of women, gaunt and emaciated, lay huddled on wooden bunks on the floor, some barely covered by rags. Their skin was stretched taut over bone, eyes sunken and hollow, staring blankly ahead or at the ceiling. They were ghost-like, barely human, radiating an aura of profound suffering. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper cut through the silence, a desperate plea. "Water. Wasser." Morrison felt a cold fist clench in his stomach. His orders echoed in his mind. Maintain patrol, avoid engagement. But what he saw defied all military protocol. These weren't soldiers to be bypassed. They were human beings left to die, forgotten by a war that had moved on. Hughes, standing behind him, looked equally horrified, his face pale. "Blimey, Sarge," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "They've just left 'em." Tommy, seeing the scene, visibly reeled, his young face contorted in disbelief and disgust. Macmillan, stoic as ever, simply shook his head slowly, a deep sadness in his eyes. Morrison knelt beside one woman, her eyes barely slits, her breath shallow. Her hand, little more than bone and parchment-thin skin, twitched feebly. He instinctively reached for his canteen, unscrewing the cap with trembling fingers. He poured a few drops onto her lips. Her eyes fluttered, focusing on him for a brief, agonizing moment before closing again. This was a nightmare made real, a testament to the depths of human cruelty. He looked at his men. Their faces mirrored his own internal struggle. The strategic objectives of their mission suddenly seemed utterly insignificant compared to the profound immediate need before them. Hughes, always the pragmatist, cleared his throat. "Sarge, we can't stay here. Orders are clear, and we're deep behind enemy lines. Moving them, it's impossible. We've got limited rations, no transport, and God knows who's still lurking in these woods." He was right, of course. Everything he said was logical, militarily sound. Their small unit was ill-equipped for a mass rescue. The risk was immense, not just to their mission, but to their lives, and potentially to the lives of the women themselves if they tried and failed. Morrison felt a growing anger, not at Hughes, but at the situation, at the war, at the system that could allow such a thing to happen, and at the thought that he should simply turn his back. He remembered Sinclair's clipped tones over the radio that morning, the lieutenant colonel's rigid adherence to procedure. "Sergeant Morrison, any deviation from your designated patrol route will be considered insubordination with severe consequences. The strategic importance of your reconnaissance cannot be overstated." The words felt hollow, a meaningless drone against the silent agony surrounding him. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep, ragged breath. He pictured the official reports, the cold bureaucratic language that would describe these women as casualties of war, a statistic, a footnote, but they were not footnotes. They were mothers, sisters, daughters, fighters, survivors. He opened his eyes, looking again at the woman on the bunk, then sweeping his gaze across the faces of the others. There was a faint flicker of hope in some of their eyes now, a desperate, fragile ember ignited by the sight of Allied uniforms. He couldn't extinguish that. He wouldn't. Morrison stood up, his jaw set, a new resolve hardening his features. "Hughes," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "these women are coming with us." Hughes stared, his mouth opening then closing, unable to form a coherent protest. Tommy looked up, a glimmer of relief mingled with apprehension on his face. Macmillan simply nodded, a silent endorsement of the moral imperative. Morrison turned back to the nearest woman, extending his hand. His voice, though still hushed, carried a new authority, a promise of deliverance. "You're coming with me." He knew in that moment that he had crossed a line, one from which there was no turning back. His career, perhaps his life, hung in the balance. But his conscience finally was clear. The small unit, despite Hughes's continued quiet remonstrances about logistical impossibilities, began to move. They carefully offered sips of water, crumbled what little hardtack they had into a paste for the most severely weakened. Morrison organized the movement, prioritizing those who could walk with assistance, those who needed to be carried. The faces of the women, once devoid of expression, began to show faint tremors of hope, or perhaps just the sheer effort of clinging to life. Among them was Anna Petrov, a Soviet soldier. Her eyes, though deeply sunken, still held a piercing intensity. She watched Morrison with a mixture of suspicion and a dawning, fragile trust. Beside her, Marie Dubois, a French resistance fighter, slender but with an inner steel, observed the British soldiers with a calculating gaze, her mind already assessing their capabilities and the terrain. A young German civilian, Elena Schmidt, also amongst the prisoners, kept her head low, her fear palpable, her allegiance unclear even to herself. Morrison issued commands in a low voice, trying to conserve their energy. "Mac, see if you can scavenge any blankets, anything to protect them from the cold. Tommy, keep watch at the perimeter. Hughes, assess their conditions. Who can move? Who needs help?" The urgency was clear. They couldn't stay here, the camp was a tomb. And who knew when a retreating German unit might stumble upon it? The air was thick with the weight of their impossible task, but a new, quiet determination settled over the small group of rescuers and rescued alike. The journey, Morrison knew, had just begun, and it would be fraught with unimaginable peril. Hours later, under the shroud of a starless sky, the weary group moved like ghosts through the skeletal trees. The silence of the forest, once menacing, now offered a fragile cloak of concealment. The air was biting, a cruel contrast to the humid warmth of their last days in the camp. Each step was a monumental effort, especially for the women, whose malnourished bodies screamed in protest. Morrison walked at the head, his senses attuned to every sound, every shadow. Hughes, ever the realist, brought up the rear, his rifle scanning the darkness. The other two privates, Tommy and Mac, helped support the weakest of the women, their faces set in grim determination. Anna, the Soviet soldier, her movements surprisingly agile despite her weakness, kept close to Morrison. Her eyes, sharper than anyone expected, seemed to pierce the gloom. Marie, the Frenchwoman, her knowledge of the European terrain evident, offered quiet suggestions for routes, her voice a raspy whisper. Eleanor, the German civilian, clung to the shadows, her fear of German soldiers warring with her gratitude towards her rescuers. She was a silent observer, absorbing every nuance, every flicker of emotion. The terrain itself was a constant adversary. Bomb craters pockmarked the landscape, forcing detours. Patches of mud sucked at their boots, threatening to strand the weakest. Distant artillery fire, a constant low rumble, served as a chilling reminder of the ongoing war, the same war that had forgotten these women. They moved through ghost villages, their windows like vacant eyesores, homes abandoned in haste, possessions scattered like forgotten memories. These were stark reminders of the brutal reality of their mission. During brief, snatched moments of rest, usually hidden deep within dense thickets, Morrison tried to speak with the women. His German was passable, enough to glean fragments of their stories. Anna, her voice hoarse, spoke of forced marches, the bitter cold, and the systematic starvation. "They wanted us to disappear," she rasped, her eyes burning with an unextinguished fire. "They wanted us to be erased." Her words painted a vivid picture of the sheer will it took for her to survive, not just the physical torment, but the psychological assault. She had seen countless others simply give up, fading into nothingness. Marie, when she spoke, did so with a sharp, tactical precision. "We moved mostly by night, small groups, hard to track." She described the clandestine networks of the French resistance, the constant paranoia, the ingenuity required to evade capture. She recounted brushes with the Gestapo, the brutal interrogations, the unwavering loyalty of her comrades. Her knowledge of covert movement, of blending into the background, proved invaluable. She scanned the horizon constantly, her eyes missing nothing, a true survivor. Elena, however, remained largely silent. She spoke only when directly addressed, her answers clipped, her gaze downcast. Morrison noticed her flinch whenever a distant sound of a vehicle or a shouted German word reached them. Her fear was different from the others, laced with an internal conflict. He knew instinctively there was more to her story, a hidden complexity beneath her quiet demeanor. He offered her his own water bottle more often, a small gesture of reassurance that seemed to momentarily ease her tension. Morrison found himself constantly re-evaluating his understanding of the war. The grand strategies, the sweeping offensives, the heroic narratives, they all seemed distant, almost irrelevant, in the face of the immediate, visceral struggle for survival that these women represented. His personal act of defiance, of choosing humanity over protocol, suddenly felt like the most significant action he had taken throughout the entire conflict. He saw the resilience, the raw strength of the human spirit in Anna's unwavering gaze, the quiet defiance in Marie's stance, and even the desperate, fragile hope in Elena's guarded expressions. This was a different kind of heroism, one that wouldn't be found in medals or dispatches, but in the simple act of choosing to live, to help, to endure. Days bled into nights. The meager rations dwindled. The cold gnawed at their bones. Exhaustion became a constant companion, a heavy cloak draped over every member of the group. Hughes, though still outwardly cautious, had stopped openly questioning Morrison's decision. He saw the fire in the women's eyes, the sheer determination to take another step, and he too had found a new resolve. Tommy, his initial shock wearing off, found strength in the women's resilience, his eagerness replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. Mac, dependable as ever, carried the injured without complaint, his silent strength a balm to their weary souls. They navigated through a bewildering tapestry of burnt-out villages, dense, dark forests, and open fields that made them feel terrifyingly exposed. The threat of encountering German stragglers was ever present. These weren't organized units, but desperate, often brutal remnants of an army collapsing in on itself, unpredictable and dangerous. They learned to move with almost supernatural stealth, hiding in ditches, pressing themselves against crumbling walls, their movements a synchronized dance of survival. Then they saw it. A bridge. a crucial artery over a churning, swollen river, a lifeline to the Allied lines that lay tantalizingly close, but it was not intact. The central span had been blown, a gaping maw of twisted metal and splintered wood. The river below roared, a torrent of icy, dark water. It was a cruel mockery of hope. Morrison felt a wave of despair wash over him. This was a critical obstacle, seemingly impassable for their weakened group. Tensions flared. Some of the women, seeing their escape route blocked, began to murmur, their fragile hopes threatening to shatter. A few started to weep, their sobs echoing in the sudden, desolate silence. Hughes gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. "Sarge, we're cut off. We can't cross that. Not with them. We should send one man back, try to link up with a larger unit, tell them what we found." The suggestion, while pragmatic, felt like a betrayal. It meant leaving these women, potentially to their fates. Morrison studied the river, his mind racing. There had to be a way. He noticed Marie studying the opposite bank, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There was a ferry crossing, upstream," she rasped, pointing a skeletal finger. "Or a hidden path beneath the old mill. But it would mean moving back, further into territory we just cleared." Retreating was a dangerous proposition, exposing them to areas they thought safe. But forging ahead across this river was suicide. Just as Morrison was weighing their dwindling options, a guttural shout echoed from the opposite bank, followed by the clatter of boots on rubble. A German patrol. They had been spotted. The bridge, which had seemed like a symbol of their failed escape, now became a perilous trap. "Get down!" Morrison roared, pushing Marie and Anna behind a crumbling concrete barrier. Hughes, Tommy and Mac immediately returned fire, their rifles spitting bursts of flame into the gloom. Captain Müller, a man whose uniform was still meticulously pressed despite the chaos of the collapsing Reich, surveyed the scene with cold, calculating eyes. He had been leading his small dedicated unit through the forest, seeking out pockets of resistance and Allied stragglers, determined to inflict as much damage as possible before the inevitable end. He saw the British uniforms, then the women, and a thin, cruel smile touched his lips. Prisoners. A prize. A symbolic victory in a war of endless defeats. Morrison tried to shout a warning, to negotiate, to buy time. "They are unarmed civilians. Medical attention needed." But his words were met with a fresh volley of gunfire. Müller's men were disciplined, ruthless. They were coming for them. The British unit was severely outnumbered, outgunned. The firefight was short, brutal, and devastating. Tommy cried out, clutching his arm, blood blooming on his sleeve. Macmillan, covering their retreat, took a hit to his leg, collapsing with a grunt of pain. Hughes, his face streaked with dirt and fear, kept firing, but it was a desperate, losing battle. Morrison felt a sickening lurch in his stomach as his world began to spin. He saw Müller's cold eyes, his triumph. He had failed. His noble intentions, his defiance of orders, had led them directly into this trap. He fired his last rounds, but it was useless. The women screamed, a collective cry of despair, as German soldiers swarmed them, bayonets glinting in the dim light. They were overwhelmed, forced to drop their weapons. Morrison felt a sharp, brutal blow to his head. The world tilted, then went black. When he came to, he was on his knees, his hands bound, a rifle butt pressed to his neck. Müller stood over him, his face a mask of contempt. A British officer abandoning his duties for these animals. Müller spat the words with venom, kicking Morrison in the ribs. Pain flared, but Morrison's gaze locked onto the women, now being roughly herded together. Anna's eyes met his, a flicker of raw defiance still burning within their depths. Marie glared at Müller, an unyielding hatred in her gaze. Elena, once again, was a picture of silent terror, her head bowed. Morrison felt the bitter taste of defeat. He had tried to do good, to follow his conscience, and it had led them all to this. He was brutally beaten, his face swelling, a throbbing agony radiating through his skull. He wondered, in the haze of pain, if Hughes had been right. Was a single act of humanity worth this? Worth the recapture of these women? Their suffering prolonged, perhaps ending in a worse fate? Müller stood over him, impassive. Morrison had taken a gamble, and he had lost everything. The women were being separated. Some pushed towards a waiting truck. Others marched back into the woods. He managed a final glance at Anna and Marie, their eyes still holding that spark, a defiant farewell. They were prisoners once more, and he, their would-be rescuer, was utterly broken. The world outside the dark, cramped cellar was a cacophony of distant gunfire and German shouts, a constant, chilling reminder of their desperate situation. Morrison lay in a heap on the cold, damp earth, his body a map of pain. His head throbbed, ribs ached, and every breath was a shallow, painful effort. He was alone, or so he thought. A faint rustle in the shadows revealed Anna, her face a bruised and bloody mess, but her eyes, those same piercing eyes, still held an unyielding fire. She had been thrown in here with him, unnoticed in the chaos. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, but he noticed a small, almost imperceptible movement from her. She was working at her own restraints, her fingers surprisingly nimble despite her emaciation. He watched, mesmerized, as she managed to loosen a knot, then another. The sight ignited a spark of hope he thought had been extinguished. He had failed, but perhaps they had not. The heavy wooden door creaked open, admitting a sliver of light and the ominous silhouette of a German guard. Anna froze, her hands still. The guard, a young, nervous-looking soldier, threw a meager ration of stale bread onto the floor before slamming the door shut. Anna waited, then resumed her work. Morrison felt a surge of respect for this woman, a strength he hadn't fully appreciated. Hours later, the cellar door opened again. This time, it was Elena, pushed roughly into the cell. Her face was pale, eyes wide with terror, but she carried a small, heavy bundle wrapped in canvas. The guards didn't notice it or didn't care. As the door clanged shut, Elena sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. Anna quickly shushed her, gesturing towards the bundle. Elena, trembling, unwrapped it. Inside were two small, crudely fashioned knives, a coil of thin rope and a tattered map. A flicker of understanding passed between Morrison and Anna. Elena, the quiet, fearful civilian, was more than she seemed. It was Marie, however, who orchestrated the escape. Her cunning and strategic mind, honed by years of resistance, proved invaluable. During their brief captivity, she had managed to assess their surroundings, studying the guards' routines, identifying weak points. She had also, miraculously, made contact with Elena, who had connections within the local populace. Elena, it turned out, had been an unwilling informant for the German authorities, forced to report on local activities, but her conscience, her deep-seated moral compass, had been awakened by the sight of the starving prisoners. She had risked everything to bring them these tools, and information about the guards' shift changes. The escape was a symphony of precision and desperate courage. Anna, using the small knife Eleanor provided, silently dispatched the guard on duty, her movements swift and brutal, a testament to her combat experience. Morrison, his binds now cut, moved with renewed purpose, the pain in his body temporarily forgotten. They used the rope to scale a low wall, relying on Marie's whispered directions to navigate the labyrinthine camp. Mac and Tommy, held in a separate barrack, were freed in a coordinated effort, their injuries momentarily forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. Hughes, still pragmatic but now fully committed, provided crucial cover fire, silencing a lone guard who had raised the alarm. The climax was a desperate, brutal confrontation with Captain Müller and his remaining men. Müller, realizing the escape, had rallied his forces, determined to prevent this final humiliation. The battle took place on the outskirts of the camp, a chaotic clash amidst the ruins of a partially destroyed barn. Müller, driven by a fanatical loyalty to a dying cause, fought with a savage intensity. He singled out Morrison, their duel a microcosm of the larger conflict, a battle between a dying ideology and a desperate surge of humanity. Morrison, despite his injuries, fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. He wasn't just fighting for his life, but for the lives of the women, for the principle that they deserved a chance at freedom. Anna, a whirlwind of motion, her movements economic and deadly, disarmed two German soldiers turning their own weapons against them. Marie, using her intimate knowledge of the terrain, led a small group of freed women in a flanking maneuver, creating a diversion that drew Müller's attention. Eleanor, no longer the terrified civilian, hurled bricks and debris at the Germans, her quiet defiance now a roaring inferno. The fight culminated in a desperate hand-to-hand struggle between Morrison and Müller. Morrison, fueled by a righteous anger, managed to disarm Müller, pinning him against a crumbling wall. Müller, defeated but unbowed, spat a final defiant curse. Morrison, his chest heaving, his body screaming in protest, delivered a final decisive blow. Müller collapsed, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. The path to Allied lines, once seemingly endless, now felt within reach. They were bruised, battered, and utterly exhausted, but victorious. The sight of distant, familiar vehicle headlights, the sound of English voices, brought a collective gasp of relief. Tears, both of sorrow and unimaginable joy, streamed down the women's faces. Medical teams swarmed them, offering immediate aid, warm blankets and sustenance. Morrison watched as Anna, Marie, and Elena were carefully taken away, their fragile bodies finally safe. A deep sense of relief washed over him, mingled with the crushing weight of his own pain and the uncertainty of his future. As expected, Morrison found himself before a military tribunal. Lieutenant Colonel Sinclair, his face grim and unyielding, presided over the proceedings. "Sergeant Morrison, your actions constituted a direct and blatant disregard for standing orders. You jeopardized your unit, diverted resources, and engaged in an unsanctioned operation. Such insubordination cannot be tolerated, regardless of the perceived outcome." Sinclair's voice was as cold and precise as a well-honed bayonet. Hughes, Tommy, and Mac, though reluctant, were forced to corroborate the facts. Morrison had disobeyed a direct order. Then the testimonies began. Anna, now stronger, her eyes still holding that powerful intensity, spoke first. Her German, surprisingly fluent, recounted the horrors of the camp, the deliberate cruelty, the slow descent into despair. She described Morrison's arrival, his initial hesitation, and then his unwavering decision. "He saw us not as prisoners, but as human beings," she stated, her voice clear and resonant. "He chose compassion when others chose indifference." Her words cut through the sterile atmosphere of the courtroom, painting a vivid picture of moral courage. Marie followed, her French accent lending an air of elegant defiance to her testimony. She spoke of Morrison's leadership, his ingenuity, and his refusal to abandon them even in the face of overwhelming odds. She detailed her own role in the escape, subtly weaving in how Morrison's trust in their abilities, his willingness to listen to a prisoner, was what ultimately saved them. "He did not see our uniforms or our nationalities, only our shared humanity," she concluded, her gaze firm, meeting Sinclair's unflinchingly. Eleanor, initially hesitant, found her voice. She spoke of her fear, her forced complicity, and how Morrison's actions, his simple kindness, had awakened her own sense of right and wrong. She described Captain Müller's cruelty, his deliberate intent to re-imprison them. Her testimony, coming from a German civilian, carried a unique weight, shedding light on the human cost of the regime even for its own people. "He saved not only our bodies but our souls," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Morrison listened to their words, a profound sense of gratitude and humility washing over him. Their testimonies, delivered with such conviction and raw emotion, were more than enough vindication for his actions. He knew, regardless of the verdict, that he had made the right choice. Sinclair, though visibly affected by the powerful words, remained stoic. He had a duty to uphold the rules, to maintain military discipline. But even he, Morrison noticed, seemed to struggle with the cold logic of the law versus the undeniable truth of human heroism. The verdict, when it came, was a compromise, a reflection of the conflicting values at play. Sergeant James Morrison was officially reprimanded for insubordination, a black mark on his military record, effectively ending any hopes of further promotion. However, he also received a commendation, a quiet acknowledgement of his exceptional bravery and humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. It was an unofficial honor, one that would never be publicly celebrated, but one that resonated deeply within the hearts of those who knew the truth. In the months that followed, as the war finally drew to a close and the world slowly began to mend, Morrison reflected on his choices. He understood the necessity of rules, of discipline, especially in wartime. But he also understood, with a clarity that transcended any military code, that there were moments when humanity demanded a different kind of courage, a different kind of duty. The scars on his body were a physical reminder of the price he had paid, but the quiet satisfaction in his soul was far more profound. The women, too, began to rebuild their shattered lives. Anna, her strength fully returned, eventually made her way back to her homeland, a silent hero carrying the indelible marks of her survival. Marie, her spirit unbroken, dedicated herself to the reconstruction of France, her ingenuity and leadership finding new purpose in a nation reborn. Eleanor, having confronted her own inner demons, became an advocate for peace and reconciliation in a Germany grappling with its past, her quiet courage now a beacon of hope. Morrison received occasional letters, carefully penned in different languages from across Europe. They were simple notes, filled with updates on their lives, expressions of enduring gratitude, and sometimes just a single, powerful word, thank you. He kept them in a worn leather pouch, a tangible reminder of the lives he had touched, the impossible rescue he had undertaken. He often thought of the destroyed bridge, the moment he almost gave in to despair. But then he remembered Anna's piercing eyes, Marie's defiant stance, Elena's trembling courage. He remembered the simple, profound act of saying, "You're coming with me." He understood now that true heroism wasn't always about following orders, but sometimes about choosing to forge a new path guided by the unwavering compass of one's own humanity. The war had taken so much, but it had also revealed the extraordinary capacity for kindness, for courage, for resilience, even in the darkest of hours. And as he looked towards the uncertain future, he carried with him not the weight of reprimand, but the quiet, profound satisfaction of a man who, when faced with an impossible choice, had chosen to rescue not just lives, but hope itself. His story would never be in the history books, but it was etched forever in the hearts of those he saved, and in his own unwavering conscience. He was a silent guardian, a quiet hero, a testament to the enduring power of humanity amidst the savagery of war. And in the stillness of his thoughts, he knew without a shadow of a doubt that he would do it all again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this powerful story of courage and humanity, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps us bring more incredible stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest content. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this story in the comments below. What moment touched you the most? Your engagement means the world to us and helps us continue creating meaningful content. Until next time, keep believing in the power of human compassion